The days of oil field workers wasting countless hours lost searching for pump jacks and well pads in a maze of unmapped lease roads are over. Well Site Navigator, the most downloaded oil field mobile app ever, now offers turn-by-turn directions to over 1 million wells through lease road navigation technology. We've mapped tens of thousands of miles of lease roads you can't find anywhere else, and we're always adding more. With our reliable directions, oil field workers can drive right to the well site and share custom routes and locations and get more done each day. Try Well Site Navigator for free and get a $10 Amazon gift card for every friend you send us. Don't get lost. Get Well Site Navigator.
He got fired from Kane. Now we ain't got no shame. So we started a pod. Chuck Yates needs a job.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to Chuck Yates Needs a Job, the podcast. Very honored to have my guest today, Will Franklin, on, because when you get kicked out of the private equity club, when someone will actually be seen with you, that's pretty cool. So, Will, welcome on.
Thank you. I questioned myself, but here I am. So now a lot of people will question me because it's the company that you keep.
Yeah, exactly. So, Will, walk us through your background. You're a University of Texas guy. I won't hold that against you.
Thank you.
Where'd you go to work after that?
Yeah, so graduated from UT and thought I would go to Wall Street, and instead this little E&P company in Midland called me by the name of Parker and Parsley. And I'll be honest, I really wanted to go to Harvard Business School, and that was like my goal. I'd had that since high school, and I thought, you know what? There's a lot of people who apply to HBS from Wall Street. There's not very many who apply from Midland, Texas. So I took a job working for Parker and Parsley in their corporate development group in January of '95.
So who are the people there?
So Scott Sheffield was running it at the time.
Yep.
Tim Dunn, who's our partner at Limerock, was the CFO at the time. And the group that I was involved in was run by a guy by the name of Jay McIntyre, who's kind of gone on to do things primarily outside of the industry, but he was running the group. But Tim Leach was there running engineering. Tim Dove was there running an international strategy. So, it's like, it's one of those great places to be from, and probably would have been a great place to stay.
Well, and Boone Pickens was the largest shareholder, right? At some point, was he already out at that point? Had they already?
Well,
because Parker and Parsley was the Mesa merger.
So that's what formed Pioneer, was the Mesa Parker and Parsley merger.
And what year did that happen?
I should know, but I don't. So I left in '96, and that happened maybe a year or two later after I left. Okay. And so I left, and this is something we should all remember about early in our careers. You get really frustrated about things not going the way that you want them to go. You think you're not learning things. I went there thinking, I'm going to do mergers and acquisitions, but I'm going to do it from the buy side. And this is going to be great because I'm going to be doing deals. And instead, commodity prices rolled. We became the capital budgeting group, the divestiture group, the bank negotiating group, which, guess what? All of that stuff is stuff that I use every day in my career. You don't do an M&A deal every day, but you're always working on those other items. And, but I didn't fully appreciate that at the time. But it turned out to be a great experience. But I was like, this isn't what I want to do. By that point, I was married to my wife, Liz. We kind of joke. I'm in Midland from start in January. Mid-February, I've proposed to my now wife. It didn't take long being alone in Midland that I made sure I got her out there with
dating
me.
Tips from Chuck Yates Needs a Job. Send your man to Midland. You'll get your ring.
So we got married. But where I was going with that was, so as I was thinking about leaving, and things were funny. So 9 months into the job, the guy who had recruited me left to Enron, and he called me and said, hey, why don't you come to Enron? And so I started entertaining this, okay, I'm going to go to Enron, and I start interviewing and ultimately get an offer. And then I go back to Parker and Parsley. I'm like, okay, this didn't really work out. I'm going to go over to Enron. They're like, no, you need to stay. This is the place for you. And they gave me a slight raise. I mean, the numbers are rounding errors for today, but they gave me a raise.
It is still more than
stayed.
I make today.
There you go.
Yes.
Okay, very fair, very fair. Maybe not more than you spend, but more than you make.
That's fair.
So I stayed, and that's another life lesson. It's like when your heart is gone, you probably should just go and be careful that you don't let kind of money talk too much. And so we stayed another 9 months.
Navy SEAL, when they quit, they're allowed whatever 5 or 10 seconds or 15 seconds to change their mind.
Did not know that.
But I've heard one of the trainers say, I've never seen someone change their mind and then make it through. That once the heart's gone, it's gone. Yeah,
it really is. So and anyway, I learned that really early because I stayed, and it was a great place. Don't get me wrong. It was just my head was, I need to do X, Y, and Z. And I didn't think that I was getting X, Y, and Z. And as I said, I learned a lot more than I ever appreciated, but it took 10 years to look back on that period and say, that was a really meaningful period for my own internal growth. And that's just perspective. And so so I left in 96, and the prospects, and the whole reason I brought up getting married was the prospects of going to New York with a wife who is a teacher and myself. I was like, okay, well, I don't want to live married with a bunch of roommates, but teachers don't make a lot of money. So that isn't going to contribute a lot to rent in New York City. Right. And so I had an offer from Simmons & Company coming out of undergrad, and called Simmons back up and said, would you have room for me? And thankfully they did. I was one of the last analysts at Simmons to work directly for Matt Simmons on a project, which is another one of those, just kind of a classic individual in the industry who brought a ton of wherewithal, high class individual, and somebody from whom you learn a ton. And, I kind of lucked out getting to work on a project where he kind of came off the sidelines in order to help on something. And I worked directly for Matt at Simmons for a little bit.
Oh, wow. So who else is at Simmons at the time? Barry Donovan? Is Barry there?
Barry was there.
Okay.
Joe Bob Edwards was there. John Griggs was there. Nick Swyka, the senior, not over at Select Energy Services. Ben Gwill, was there.
That's right.
Yeah. So
and
again,
Pickering is
so Pickering
research.
Dan and I started. He started a month maybe before me. So we joined very similar timelines. And that's the nature of the industry, a really small industry, but also the nature of working at good places where you just wind up, same thing. You go back to Parker and Parsley and all of those various people, and then you wind up at Simmons and where all those various people have kind of turned up. It's cool.
Just an amazing amount of talent. So a couple of years at Parker Parsley, and then a couple of years at
Simmons, and Simmons was also great because Matt and that team had a great track record of getting people into HBS. So don't forget what one of my key drivers was. So I really wanted to go to HBS. And so I did apply to 2 business schools, one unnamed place over on the West Coast that would have nothing to do with a person like me. You're probably a much better Stanford applicant than I am. I don't have that creative nature that they tend to look for. But Harvard said yes, luckily by the flip of a coin, and God's blessing. I got into HBS. I remember Liz called me. The envelope was in her hands. I open envelopes with a letter opener. My wife rips things open. And so
an A always marries a Z.
Exactly.
Opposites
and that envelope is ripped open. I still have it somewhere in a drawer, but she was excited for me and
so let me tell you my Harvard story.
Please do.
So everybody in the Yates family has always gone to Rice. My grandfather is the class of, I believe, 1930. Great aunt goes there. Mom and dad go there. Uncle goes there. So I'm expected to go to Rice. So I decide about sophomore year in high school, I'm going to Harvard. And this, of course, just scares the heck out of my mom. My poor, young, sweet son's going to go off to the East Coast, marry Amy Carter, become some rabble-rousing liberal, and all this. So Dad comes to me. Dad's a smart guy. Dad comes to me and says, hey, I know you want to go to Harvard. You need to go visit it. You can't just show up on campus. I go, that's fair, Dad. I'll go. I'll go next summer. And Dad goes, nah, you ought to go over Christmas break. And I'm like, sure. Mom says, the hardest thing I ever did as your mother, I allowed you to get on the plane without a jacket. Because it was 80 degrees in Houston. I'm wearing jeans and a T-shirt. And I get up to Boston. It's snowing.
And they let you into Harvard?
No.
Okay, exactly.
Well, that's an idiot right there.
Yeah.
The Texan shows up without a coat. But no, I remember walking around campus, and I went and bought a coat.
Sure.
But I remember walking around campus, and here's our newest building. It was built in 1787. And so I came back and told my parents I was going to Rice.
There you go.
Yeah. Harvard did not accept me, though. Mom brought the envelope down to school when we got it, and she goes, here it is. And I go, it feels pretty light, Mom. And she goes, yeah, I don't think that's an admissions packet. So,
well, I didn't even apply undergrad. I'm sure I wouldn't have gotten in either. And like I said, it was a total flip of the coin. But I go back to, Harvard builds their business school classes, really looking at, before we all started talking about diversity, they were looking for a diversity of experience in the classroom. And that goes back to, I can't help but think a stint in Midland was probably meaningful to getting one of those seats in that, section of 80 people and being a very different background than most of the people in the room.
Either that or they didn't know what it was.
Probably. More likely.
So where do you go after you graduate from business school?
So I ultimately went to Riverstone, but there was an acceptance of another offer before I actually wound up at Riverstone. So coming out of business school, I really wanted to get into private equity. And this was before there were tracks into private equity.
Right.
Honest with you, I hardly knew what private equity was. I sold one company at Simmons to a private equity firm, and I was like, that seems like where I want to be. And so that kind of put it on my track or on my list. And then, you get to HBS and you begin to get exposure to people who've worked in it and begin to see things. And you're like, okay, yeah, that seems right for me. And I started interviewing, and I told myself, I was like, I'm not going to be in the energy business. My father was in the energy business. I watched him struggle to pay off debt and, get through the 80s. And God bless him, he did. He preserved his name. He paid every dollar back that he borrowed. But it was a tough existence. And I was like, no way am I going to do that. But the problem of being in Texas is once oil's in your blood, it's kind of in your blood. And, so I'm looking for private equity coming out of HBS, and the private equity that wanted to talk to me was an energy group within a firm that no longer exists, the Beacon Group.
Oh, yeah. Rich Hobby.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So again, a few people. And so who
else was there?
So John Lancaster.
That's right. It was
the one who recruited me over there. And then, as you know, he went to Riverstone. And so that kind of pulls that full circle together. That's how I wound up. But, Jeff Boise had started it. For those who don't know, I mean, if you go and read Barbarians at the Gate, which is, the classic of the buyout industry, and Jeff is one of the key investment bankers involved in that transaction and a former Goldman person. And, Limerock has Goldman people and Riverstone has Goldman.
The Beacon Group was basically a bunch of ex-Goldman guys.
Exactly. And so it is the whole Goldman club amongst all of these organizations that I was talking to. So why they talked to me, I have no idea, because that was not me. But so I accepted the offer, and then Beacon, even before I've graduated, Beacon announces that they're selling to Chase, and they couldn't guarantee me I was going to wind up in the private equity group.
So I've got a great story about Beacon.
Okay.
So I'm the oldest of 4 boys. Brother number 3, Kenny, his best friend is a fellow by the name of Chris Kristanek. So Chris goes to Yale, and Chris is a rock star. I mean, he played baseball for Yale, smart as all this. He goes to Beacon, and he's 1 year into the analyst program when that sale's announced. And what's great is you look back at Chris's career, he joined Tiger Management, and 1 year later, Julian shuts down the fund. And he's got about 4 or 5 of those. So he's like, I'm the firm killer. You hire me, and we're out.
That's like when I buy a house. That's definitely the top of the market.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly. You've picked. So,
I'm good at some things, but like buying a house is not my thing.
I got you. So So Beacon goes away.
And so here's a tip if there's anybody who's an analyst at an investment bank who ever interviews with Limerock. So my question, I don't know if I should do this, if I should kind of tell them what my question is, but my question
nobody
to everybody,
watches this podcast anyway,
so
except my mom. My mom will be ready to interview.
So my question is, tell me about a time that you have faced a moral dilemma and how you dealt with it. And the moral dilemma that I think of when I ask that question is, I've received this offer from Beacon. I accept this offer from Beacon.
Right.
And then Beacon sells, Riverstone gets formed, and I get a call from Riverstone to come interview, which I interviewed with them, and I get an offer. And so then I'm like, can I do this? And that was a big moral dilemma for me, because I believe being a man of your word and what you say is what you're going to do. And I remember I'm a different place in my faith journey today. So today I would start that with a prayer. I mean, that's
right.
how I would but back then that wasn't who I was and how I approached decision-making. And my wife and I jumped in a car and we headed up into Vermont and spent a weekend kind of talking about it. And we came back, and I don't know if it's the right answer or not, but where I came to was, they can't, I came back and I asked, can you guarantee I'm going to wind up in private equity? Because I had 7 other investment banking opportunities that I had turned down.
Right.
And I clearly didn't want to go investment banking, and they could not guarantee me that I was going to wind up on the private equity side, whereas that was my offer at Beacon. So based on that, I said, the offer is not the offer that I had received, and therefore it is fair for me to move out of that. And so I accepted the offer from Riverstone and told Beacon that I wouldn't be coming to them. And there was a woman in my class at HBS. The 2 of us had these offers. I don't think she wound up going either. It changed. Yeah.
Just so you know, I was on the other side of that. Goldman gave me an offer, and I quit my job at Stevens, moving to New York. They called back, we were just kidding. I'm like, what?
Oh my gosh.
What? Anyway.
Wow.
But I'll tell that story one day on the podcast when we do a major wine flex. When I'm drunk, I'll go through that. But yeah.
Their loss.
The executive committee at Goldman Sachs revoked my offer.
Okay. I look forward to hearing that story. Yeah.
Because in the Comanche Indian tribe, the status of a warrior was based on the status of his enemy. Mm-hmm. So the fact I pissed off somehow the executive committee, 5 people at Goldman Sachs, is pretty impressive.
Okay. So your personality is not new, and there's clearly a story here. And
exactly.
Exactly. I mean, for the executive committee to even know who you are.
That's what's so impressive.
Yeah. It's like, okay, what did he do?
So you go to Riverstone.
And, they barely had office space when I was interviewing with them, they didn't have office space. I mean, it is fresh. They are still in negotiations with the Carlyle group about, what the partnership's going to look like. And I kind of laugh. In terms,
who are the 2 guys that founded Riverstone?
So David Lucian and Pierre Lapierre. Yeah. And so Lucian
may have been the person that gave me my offer at Goldman. But anyway, the plot thickens here. But anyway, keep going.
Yeah. And so I wind up over there, and ironically, going back to HBS and wanting to be in private equity, and I had applied for an interview with the Carlyle group, and I couldn't even get an interview with the Carlyle group. And so joined Riverstone. We become the energy group for the Carlyle group at that point. And so interestingly, whenever we would take something to investment committee, Dan Daniello, one of the founders of Carlyle, would call me up to say, okay, so what's the deal? Walk me through the deal. Walk me through the investment committee. And he probably doesn't remember me from Adam, so I don't mean to oversell it. But when he retired, I wrote him a note just kind of saying, the irony is I couldn't even get an interview with the Carlyle group. And if I had worked at the Carlyle group, probably never would have met you, and probably, never would have. But I wind up at Riverstone, and I talk to you with some level of frequency because I'm the person who kind of walks you through what the deal is before we went into investment committee. And,
that's awesome.
And, just one of those right time, right place, but the opportunity to learn from, a well-known investor who had an operating background and how he thought about deals and questions and the like is just one of those unique things. And so I was at Riverstone for almost 3 years, and I get a call from Limerock.
Did you interact with Glenn Youngkin any?
I had
the governor-elect?
The now governor.
The now governor. Have we had an inauguration?
You know him from Rice, right?
I went to Rice with him.
Yeah.
Glenn played basketball
exactly.
at Rice. He didn't actually go on the court and play, but he was in uniform on the bench.
Well, there you go. Yeah. At least he got to wear the uniform.
I will say this, good guy, smart guy. I like Glenn a lot.
Totally agree. I had some limited interactions, but again, I had much less interactions with him than I did Daniello. So if Dan wouldn't remember me, which I guess he probably wouldn't, like Glenn, wouldn't remember me, but yes, and the same. And that's all that I've heard about him is really good.
Yeah, and the pay seems to be good when you're employee number 17.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Glenn seemed to do all right. Yeah.
Not too bad. Yeah, so 3 years, Riverstone. And a side story on that. So when I was at, so my son was born in 2001, a couple of weeks before September 11th. And so we were in the city, and the investor conference was going on for the Carlyle group. And so I was a very modern father now that I think back to it. So I actually stayed in New York and stayed with my wife and didn't go to the conference because we had this newborn kid. And my first day back into the office was in the middle of the conference, which was September 11th. And so we all know what happened on that fateful day. But I wound up being the senior-most person in the office that day. And, we all have our memories from that day, but I particularly remember my assistant who had worked at Cantor Fitzgerald and had, just a gazillion colleagues who are in that building as you're kind of watching everything happen.
I had a dear friend from business school that worked for American Express. So she was down in whatever building number 6 but for whatever reason wasn't there that day.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And being in finance, I mean, we have those stories because we know people and the like. And
I mean, Maynard Holt was in one of the World Trade Centers.
Was he in
that
one
day.
of the towers?
Yeah.
Oh.
He emerged from a subway tunnel covered in white dust, 2 hours later or whatever. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So
yeah. Anyway, I don't know what took me there, but anyway, that's a story. So thankfully we got through all that with nothing at all except a story, and just very thankful. And you really appreciate life when you have a kid, and I know you have 3, and those sorts of things really frame what's important to you. And yeah, with a 2-week-old kid, that certainly all came into focus as we went through that. But anyway, good experience with Riverstone.
So Chris Sorrells, right?
I do.
He was a banker at Bank of America, and now he's at Natural Gas Partners. He does energy technology stuff for him. Chris, literally on September 10th, was racing to the airport. I believe he was in New York to a meeting. He gets to the gate, and the gate's already shut for his flight. And he's sitting there arguing, please, 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 please. Somehow the plane comes back. The gate, they open the gate. He's allowed to get on his flight to San Francisco or LA, wherever it was going. In the meantime, his assistant had booked him on one of the flights that flew into the trade towers.
No
Yeah.
way.
So he would have been on that flight the next morning.
I've never heard that story from him.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Yeah. No, it's to your point about just appreciating life and recognizing how fragile it is. So.
Yeah. I mean, we can't forget that. And, we'll get later into this conversation and talk about some stuff I'm doing now, but our values and it all just comes down to interactions. And that's one of the downsides of COVID. And I feel it in our office today. It's like, some people are at home, some people are up in the office. We don't have those interactions, and you can just feel the tension because you don't interact with people the way. There's a natural edge that we all have because we've kind of lost that. And so events like living through these last 2 years of COVID or something like September 11th, and maybe I don't really want to say there's good news about September 11th, but it becomes a exclamation point and focus that helps you come to that. These prolonged periods like we've gone through with COVID are kind of much harder to really appreciate those lessons that we're beginning to figure out after suffering so long of being, remote or communicating through our phones and an online Zoom as opposed to doing business the way we used to do things.
I mean, I read a statistic the other day that said the average high schooler today has the amount of anxiety as a institutionalized person back in the 1920s, which maybe that was hyperbole and all,
Right.
but it is amazing the amount of sort of pressure and anxiety that comes with all these things. 9/11,
Yeah.
social media.
Yeah. I mean,
COVID.
I think you and my kids are relatively the same age. I've got a sophomore in college and a senior in high school. And yeah, I mean, my senior in high school has effectively not had a normal high school experience. And my sophomore in college he goes to school at Boston College, didn't know anybody up there. And so graduated in 2020 in the midst of, the first wave of COVID. And, we all know how tough that was. And then starts at a school where he basically doesn't know anybody and no means to meet anybody because, Massachusetts was much more locked down than we were here. So, I mean, that's
I have a kiddo in Great Barrington at college. And
Okay.
same thing. Yeah. Just amazing the lockdown. So,
yeah.
So you're at Riverstone and the phone call comes in from Limerock.
Yeah. Phone call comes in from Limerock and they had just raised their second fund. And the first fund, just to show you how incestuous all this turned out to be, the first fund was a carve out from the Beacon Group.
Was it really? I didn't know that.
It was. The first Limerock fund was a carve out from the Beacon Group.
And how big was it? Do you remember?
It was $100 million fund. So just sub 100 million, just a shy of 100 was from the Beacon Group. And then there were a few friends and family who came into it.
Because Kane Anderson Energy Fund 1 in 98 was 103 million.
There you go. Yeah. I mean, different time, different scale, so many different things. So that first fund was 1998.
And so how many people are at Limerock at the time when you get that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So you had Farber and Reynolds. They had added a Calgary office after like a year. So we had John Clarkson as one person up in Calgary.
Yep.
And then as they raised the second fund, they hired Lawrence Ross over in Aberdeen because we had half of our investments from the first fund were really North Sea oriented. So Lawrence had come from 3i and ran that office. And then they hired Tom Bates, who I think most recently before he came to Limerock would have been the CEO at Weatherford and then sold that to Intera or EVI to become Weatherford Intera.
Right.
And so he opened the Houston office and you had Pontus Wilfors. And then I joined him and so pretty small team at that point.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So what was the thought in joining Limerock? Because I joined Kane just because it's like, wow, I'm in the private equity club, Right. It was like, you were already in the club and you were getting to choose which blazer you were going to wear,
Yeah. No, you're right. And I think part of it, I think what it really came down to was, so Jay McLean, who was at Limerock, I had recruited him out of UT to work at Parker and Parsley.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. So, if there's power in your coaching tree, then I'm going to claim credit for Jay McLean, who is a phenomenal energy investor. And, I've got a lot to be thankful for by being partners with Jay McLean. But, and so I'd recruited him there. And so he called me. I had I'd met Reynolds and known Reynolds. And so, and then I'd actually worked on the Weatherford deal when I was at Simmons. So I had met Tom. Again, I was an analyst. I didn't know him well, but I had met him. And the deal about private equity. I mean, private equity, it can be tough to leave when you've been there a while.
Right.
The vesting terms are onerous and the like. And so
It happens really quickly when they show you the door, just in case you're curious.
Okay,
not that that's going to happen to you, but yeah.
I thankfully haven't faced that.
Yeah.
But if you want to leave on your own volition, these places can be painful places to leave. And so, one thing that I like to tell young people when, whether they're leaving us or, if we're just kind of completing an interview is when you think about a private equity job, really think about, is it the people, the culture, the strategy, like everything needs to gel because these are much more like marriages as opposed to jobs, given the way that the vesting and the like works. And so, for me, I really liked what I saw at Limerock with respect to the way that Farber and Reynolds are just a natural yin and yang to one another. And it was a little bit of a smaller strategy as opposed to what Riverstone was ultimately pursuing. And, that kind of fits more of my own personality of kind of getting involved with, as opposed to kind of big buyouts and thinking about all of the finance math. It's, much more, I like to visit with teams. I like to, I think teams drive value, and that's what we focus on at Limerock. So there was a whole lot of various reasons that the move made sense for me. And I just remind young people that, think about all of those things when you're thinking about where you're going.
Yeah. We used to have a joke back at Stevens where John Jacoby used to say, you want to go to summer camp with them boys or not?
Right.
And it was kind of, because it's true. I mean, yeah, once you're in bed with the vesting stuff, it doesn't change.
Yeah.
The other thing too, that I think happened during that period is we went from being, when Farber and Reynolds raised that first fund, they had to get the carve out from Beacon, but they're raising fund number 2. They're going into the private capital bucket of an institution saying something to the effect of energy's great. Here's why we're better than buyout or venture or technology. And at some point though, kind of 2005, somewhere around there, we became an allocation.
Right.
And that really changed the world, and the dollar amounts just got a lot bigger. So it became hard to leave too because of that dynamic. Because people have always said, you look at Silicon Valley, people leave Kleiner Perkins, start their own firm, tick on down the list, and you just didn't see it that much in energy. Because if you really think about it, I mean, back late 90s, it was NGP, NCAP, Limerock, Quantum was already around, Kane was around.
And on the services side, SCF was there.
SCF First Reserve was there, and it you get pretty far down the path before you start seeing the spinoffs like the Carnelians or the Edges or the Pearls and
right.
The like. So you've been there almost 20 years?
Yeah, it'll be 19 in February.
Wow. Do they give you a watch,
old.
a gold watch or something like that?
We don't have any of those traditions, no. Sometimes I send Farber and Reynolds an email. I haven't done it in a few years. I remember doing it at the 10th, and I just sent them a note, and I was like, it's been amazing 10 years. Thanks for the opportunity.
That's great. And you mainly did service stuff. I was on the E&P side. You're on the service side. This is going to be an impossible ask, but I'll go ahead and say it is. Is there any way to summarize kind of that 20 years or the last 19 years in 2 or 3 minutes? What was the market like? What was the opportunity set? What did you see change?
Yeah. You're right. It's impossible.
Because I want to more talk about where we are today in the future.
Sure, of course.
I think setting that backdrop's interesting.
Well, and just to clarify, I probably spent the first half of my time at Limerock doing E&P and services, and then the second half of my career has been almost exclusively services.
Nobody else wanted to do it. You drew the short straw.
Well, maybe a little bit of that, maybe some of the things that I'd worked on. And then we had people join the team and leave the team. And we had a number of service deals that needed to be managed. And I had the experience to manage them. And so, I inherited a few things that I've kind of managed as well. So there are a number of reasons that kind of came to fruition. But I think to answer your question, it's maybe a little bit of just, how everything is cyclical. They rhyme, of course, they're never exactly the same, but like my first period at Limerock, felt a little bit like things do now, maybe not quite as bad. But what I mean by that is capital was short in supply. I mean, it was still, tough to raise those funds. And then as you addressed, as you moved on in time, those funds kind of came together. But, the first fund that I wasn't part of, that was difficult to get started. And fund 2 took a good while for Farber and Reynolds to raise. And that's as I joined them. So money wasn't easy to raise. And to your point, there weren't a whole lot of us. And, the world was just a very different world with respect to all we talked about was optimizing this declining production base in North America. And so, the last 10 years of this shale extravaganza and kind of growing production was not in anybody's purview. I mean, you'll recall, Matt Simmons was writing Twilight in the Desert, and, it was just like the world was coming to an end. And what we had to do was we had to become really good at how we eked that incremental barrel of oil or MCF of gas out. And that meant that services were really important because those services were what allowed you and engineering expertise in order to do that. And if you think about, some of the revolutionary things that have occurred with respect to our ability to kind of pull hydrocarbons out of the ground, I mean, you can't overlook the importance from a service perspective of what we did with seismic. And so seismic really opened up the world. And so that,
Mark Meyer and I, he's the podcast that's out currently. So the one we did it about a week and a half ago. I think with 3D seismic, at least in my career, that was the first time there might have been any semblance of sort of alpha in the business versus before that, you were just the inflation hedge.
That's right.
We talked about this. You're younger than I am, so you may not remember, but Louis Dreyfus, the E&P company during the 90s came out and said, we've got this great trading organization. We're going to hedge out natural gas prices, and we're going to lock in a rate of return on the wells we drilled. And they traded less than 1 times EBITDA during that period because the market wanted exposure to the commodity price. And so I think you're right. I mean, 3D seismic was the first time where you went, holy cow, the industry missed this. We can go hit a gusher here.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it gave us a new perception of, what we were all ultimately after. And so, technology is just amazing. And then ultimately we all know what, fracking developments ultimately allowed us to do. And, so there again, that's the combination of, smart upstream engineers working with service companies to, get more hydrocarbons out of the ground. And so, sorry, we got off track on what my first couple of years looked like.
No, this is interesting because was the point of your investing back then more VC technology type stuff? Because as I recall, because I was never a service guy, First Reserve and SCF were more buyout. That was more financially, let's pick a platform company, bolt on acquisitions, and then sell it to somebody. What were y'all doing at Limerock?
Yeah, so we had a mix of VC. We tried to. This never works, by the way. We tried to get into technologies just as they were commercial. And you know what? In the oil field, nothing is commercial until it's truly commercial, and it always takes longer than you think. And so there was some of that in the portfolio, but we really described ourselves as growth capital. So you've got a service company that's now secured a contract with a larger E&P, and therefore you kind of see the work, you've seen the relationship come together, and a management team's outgrown their bank. And at that point, they needed growth capital. And I know this is kind of mind-blowing because that's not the world we're in today, but that was the world we were in back then, right? Yeah. And so the assets were all old by that point. There was a new generation of investment that needed to occur, and that's what we were providing. And then we were also, and this is where I spent a bunch of my time, we were deep value people. And so how did you play hard assets into a growing service intensive business? And so my first day at Limerock was on a plane up to Wyoming to start due diligence on a land rig driller that we wound up investing in. We kind of closed it, I guess, a month plus into my employment. And, and then we were like, it wound up being a good deal. We got proactively approached on it to sell. We weren't even at the 1-year hold period. And so, we do care about taxes and the like. And, thankfully, by the time you got everything ironed out, that we did get beyond the 1-year hold period. But, we put together a land drilling company by taking a bunch of 80s rigs, providing the capital in order to update the pumps on them and retrofit this rig fleet focused on the Rockies, because the Rockies were gas short at that time period. So, again, these are just kind of mind-blowing ideas, but California actually wanted gas back then. And remember, you had the Ruby pipeline that was being developed, and you wanted to get gas over there. And we kind of saw the Rockies growing and thought, and we had a management team approach us with this concept of they had this company, they needed the capital to expand their fleet. And we're like, this makes sense. All of the factors are coming together, and put it together. And within a year had sold it to Grey Wolf. And so we did that. We did Hercules Offshore, where, we're buying old rigs from Parker, and we're buying some lift boats, and we're creating this new company with a former company's name, and, which was pretty, it wasn't a buyout, but it was, pretty sophisticated finance stuff, particularly back at that time, in terms of doing 2 reasonably sized deals and starting up a company from scratch that, by the time we added the lift boats there's some international context going into that business as well, but it was really focused on the Gulf of Mexico. And, Parker had a failed sale process on these rigs. We hung around the hoop, and then we started making diligence calls amongst our upstream friends to kind of say, what is the outlook for the Gulf of Mexico? What's going to happen? And you probably know that we are partners with the guys over at Arena Energy. And so that was one of the calls that we made, was over to that team to try to get a sense as to what are the opportunities. And, the quote that always gets thrown around, I think it's true, but maybe it's just legend at this point, but it was like, there's not a lot of great opportunities out there for others, but we've got phenomenal backlog and opportunity. And, and we heard that from a few different parties. And so that really convinced us that, the activity is going to be there. Let's buy these rigs. And, we bought them. We bought them right. The cycle worked for us really well. We went to take that thing public. And I remember we were kind of struggling with, what do we have anything that actually qualifies us to go public, and how do we get around? We don't have 3 years of financials. And so, what was the original organization, and working with some smart lawyers to ensure that we could, actually meet the regulatory requirements to get that thing public, and, took it public quickly. And, thankfully didn't overstay our welcome, but had a really good deal embedded in there as well. And I remember, another thing you have to know as an investor is, which Limerock's done a really good job of walking this line, but like, don't believe your stuff so much that you never get rid of it, but also, don't go too soon. But, I remember, again, because I'm services and Reynolds kind of is the head of our services arm. I remember kind of saying, I really, really like what we've got here in Hercules. And, he had learned some tough lessons with their first fund. I mean, it turned out to be a very good fund, but, it's a portfolio. So you're always learning something in there. And he was like, well, let's not overstay our welcome in this one. And, that turned out to ultimately be, the right thing. And so we had a good deal. And unfortunately, like, nobody is going to get through what all ultimately occurred in 2014 and the like, but tough, Well,
what I think we fundamentally did wrong, with some hindsight now, and getting to be critical since I'm out of the club. But one of the things I think we did fundamentally wrong is we were so hardcore on G&A of, you got to have lower salaries. And we were all about these waterfalls that would give us, get us our money back, get us a return, and then we'd give bigger and bigger hurdles. I think it created a weird dynamic in that if you had a home run, management realizes when they're in the high splits, they're like, man, I'm spending 50 cents of every dollar here. we're going to sell. I don't need a 50-50 partner.
Right.
And so we would wind up, I think, selling the home runs too early. And then conversely, the other thing we did that was so bad is there was this mystical 2 times our money. And we would hang on at 1.87 times our money to try to get to the 2 and wipe stuff out.
Right.
And so I think and we got better about that over time, but I think that was kind of the to Reynolds's point. Let's not overstay our welcome here. Or, sometimes if you run a market test and the answer is 1.87 times your money, that's the answer.
I think I've heard you make that point on a podcast
before.
Really?
Yeah. It's deeply ingrained here.
Well, yeah. I mean, sometimes it's the answer. And if it's not the answer, you need to have a real investment case for why it's not, because you are re-underwriting at that point. And I kind of make that point because, I mean, we've done that. We've done a GP-led buyouts of 2 of our funds, funds 4 and 6. And, there are times when, we've held deep conviction and, that's worked really well. And, I would go back to fund 1, again, predating myself, but, we had a oil sands deal that we could have sold, at nice multiple 2 and nice multiple 4, and didn't.
I think Kane was in that deal with you.
Were they in that one?
We were in. I didn't do any of the oil sand stuff. We had the joke is my territory was outside the loop, Houston, and the lower 48, and then we had other folks that would work inside the loop, Houston, and Calgary.
Okay.
So I never really did anything with the oil sands, but yeah, I remember the same thing of just going, holy cow, we've got this huge win. And you realize in hindsight, that's just a proxy for oil price.
That is what oil sands definitely were. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, I don't mean to disagree with your lesson, but I do think it's been a differentiator for us in terms of there've been a few strategic deals where
I never owned Crown Rock either. So I mean, come on.
Yeah, there's that one.
Yeah, that's like Bill Belichick sitting there going, I kind of got this Brady guy over here that's not so bad. So
yeah.
Here was my experience with the oil field service, because we bought a company that had, I don't know, workover rigs or something in Appalachia. And I went to my first board meeting. I really wasn't part of that deal, but I was the old guy at Kane that had to go sit in the board meeting. And we walked into the board meeting. The CEO walks in and said, well, I've got the results back of our drug tests. We lost half our crews. And I was like, what?
Yeah.
And I was sitting there going, I don't think there's any value I can add here. I'm not a rehab specialist. I don't know how to go recruit from prisons or whatever I needed to. So I kind of came back and said, can we not do service deals again? Because I just don't get it.
Yeah, I mean, services it's people intensive. It's a real management experience. And you want to take like the opposite end, which, I mean, we've put a decent chunk of our funds into minerals. Minerals is super efficient from a personnel perspective as opposed to, I mean, those of us who work in services spend a lot of time thinking about employee issues. And the other thing that's funny, because you mentioned the waterfalls, I never really understood why the market is so different, but like E&P management teams historically, and I'm not really talking about the last 5 years. I'm talking, there hasn't been many service investments in the last 5 years, but if you were to go back to like first 10 years of my time at Limerock, maybe first 15, it's like E&P management teams were really good at getting these waterfalls. Now they may have created these perverse incentives in them. Man, oil field services, it's like half the promote, and there's more people. And services was not good at getting maybe their fair share from that perspective. And I'm clearly a services person because you're going to see it all right here. And it's like the same thing we do today. It's like we subsidize our customers, and E&Ps have really good people that they can hedge with called banks. And then there's these contracts that may or may not hold up that you have as a service company with an EMP. But I've seen both
if you
sides
think
of that.
about it, if you're a service company looking for money, call it, in the early 2000s, you can go talk to L.E. Simmons.
Yep.
You can go talk to Limerock.
Yep.
First Reserve, I think at that point was already off the reservation, doing bigger and trying to morph into KKR at that point. Had a little more power over the management teams in terms of terms.
That's a very fair observation.
Because, in fairness, I mean, Kane, Incap, Natural Gas Partners, Quantum, there was just a lot more money chasing the same management teams. Now, I think we all kind of wound up later in life figuring out our different niches, but I mean, you'd walk into a management team's office and all the term sheets were right there,
Yes.
And so an extra 5% on the back end would win it. And guess what? The next team would get an extra 5% on the back end, and it just kept going.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And, and so that's back to my comment about, does history rhyme or repeat, or what does it exactly do? But today, I mean, we are sticking to hydrocarbons. We have Limerock New Energy, which is run by a separate team that's investing in, the new energy economy. But we at Limerock Partners continue to look at both upstream and services deals. And, services, there's a couple more names that are out there now in addition to ourselves and SCF, but there's not many that, and there were a lot. And our competition was probably more at one point was more generalist funds that were, all deciding that, okay, we can just underwrite this as a general industrial play. And you saw these big leverage checks come in, and that's when GE was playing hard in oilfield services and the like, and kind of changing the multiples. But yeah, all that kind of competition's gone away. And I think oilfield service investment bankers, the list that they have to call if they want to look for a financial party is pretty short.
Yeah. So what are investors saying today? Because, I get some feedback because I still talk to LPs these days, and it just seems dreary. I mean, we've had the red problem that we as an industry outside of Limerock. This was really funny. I was talking to Farber the other day, and I was going on my rant about how it's all just beta. You can't create alpha. And he goes, no, Chuck, let's rephrase that. You can't create alpha in the energy business. Fair enough. Of course, I did my default. I did the Silver Hill deal. Whatever you go. But, we had the red problem as an industry, lost a lot of money. We've got the green problem in terms of that. And I always hate to say, this time it's different because it never is. But this time it just feels different, that it's more pessimistic when it comes to capital. What are you kind of hearing out there from LP world? And
I mean, look, my general sense is doesn't really differentiate from what you basically said. It's a challenge. I mean, amongst the endowment and foundation crowd, the ESG, but in particular the E, is a big issue. And, to me, it's like right now, I'm not sure if there's anything that we could do absent being a net zero industry, which seems all but impossible to me, that you could attract those dollars today.
Yeah.
We have not been a big pension group, but I think that there is a more open eye, from those maybe individual or groups who will write maybe some of those larger checks to at least entertain it. But we'll see. And I don't know. I remain confident that, and I think it'll be healthy, but my prognosis is this is going to sort itself out naturally. And the way that's going to happen, I mean, energy was the outperformer today. I think energy was up 4%. And I really don't pay attention on a daily basis. But as I was driving over here, I had CNBC on, and they were talking about the outperformer, and, energy was strong last year. And, and it's a little bit of what I wonder about green energy is ultimately returns do matter. And we were in that shale period and we got over allocated, but really, what did we do? And, I'll talk about this later too, probably, but like the free markets worked. So capital allocators decided they wanted exposure to energy. They liked what they were seeing from shale. They pumped a lot into it. They pumped too much into it. And the capital markets, the energy capital markets, subsidized the U.S. economy with respect to super low cost energy that, because we had too much capital chasing these opportunities. And I can't help but ask myself, when you look at what's occurring with green energy, is there also kind of this similar just kind of rush to anything that's labeled as green, and therefore it attracts the capital? Effectively, valuation be damned from my perspective. And, I probably don't spend enough time looking at that stuff to really say that, but like that would be my high level observation. And of course, there are winners as that market is moving up. But what does it look like after a decade? Because you and I both know there were also a lot of winners in the early phase of shale as people were flipping these investments and moving them. And is that really any different than what you saw with some green companies winding up into SPACs and kind of just walking up the capital ladder? And so I remain somewhat optimistic. I don't think we'll ever get the allocation that we used to get, but nor do I think we need the allocation that we used to get. And so I think there will be fewer players playing in the market. And that will be a result of, two things. We don't need as much and not as many people are going to be interested, but fundamentally returns do attract capital. Feels like this industry has really understood that lesson. We'll see. But, I think the perspective that I bring is that I mentioned earlier is like the service companies are still struggling for that return, and the E&Ps have gotten it, and those who have balance sheets that are workable are now very focused on reducing debt and making distributions to shareholders as opposed to on the growth wheel. And that's I think a healthy discipline that I don't see going away, absent what you and I always have to deal with is what in the heck happens with OPEC. And then, the other thing that I know is going, I can just read it on your face is, but what about demand, Will? Like, where does demand ultimately go? If consumers are really thinking about, they don't want hydrocarbons. And I just think we're too early in the energy transition to get away from hydrocarbons as quickly as people think they can get away from them.
Now, I haven't done the math yet on this. I know I've mentioned this a time or two on a podcast or on the Big Digital Energy Show.
I haven't done it either, so don't ask me because
okay. Well, but
I won't have a great answer for you.
Ballpark it with me, though, is I think the amount of precious metals it takes to truly, for all of us to drive Teslas and for all of us to electrify everything, let's set aside for a second that we're burning natural gas to generate that power. I think to mine all of that, the amount of diesel you need to do that is probably more than the cars on the road. And the reason I say that is in the middle of the Congo, you can't just go plug into a socket. You're in the middle of nowhere. You're running it all off diesel. And so I'm not sure. Colin McClellan has made me a believer. I think electric cars went out just because of performance. I drove a Tesla for 6 years. It was a great car. Couldn't go to Austin so well, but outside of that, it was a great car. So I actually think electric vehicles just went out on performance type stuff or win a large market share because of that. But I think at the end of the day, they're made out of a bunch of petroleum-based products, and the precious metals needed to do all that, you got to mine it.
Yes.
And you mine with diesel.
Yeah. But unfortunately, the story gets told, oh, no, we're doing everything electric. And they're just ignoring the diesel generator that's right there that's doing everything with electric motors.
I love the memes where you've got the diesel generator powering the Tesla car.
Right. Oh, yeah.
So, okay, I got another theory I'm going to throw at you since So as recently as Tuesday, I was incredibly pessimistic about energy being able to attract new capital. I've been running around preaching, your cash flow's it. So watch every penny, watch every nickel, watch every dime. I think I heard a story that I'm willing to think about, and I might even start buying off on it, is Because my whole premise is we're 3% of the S&P 500, so nobody cares about us.
Right.
And so to your point, returns matter. A CIO doesn't have to worry about 3% of the S&P 500. So a CFO will never, or CIO will never lose their job because they didn't beat the index because of messing with energy. You'll 3%. You probably don't even have to buy energy if you don't want. Maybe if you do, you buy Pioneer and Diamondback.
Right.
But here's the thing I've heard that kind of gives me hope, and I want to get your take on it, is we're seeing, presumably right now, kind of this rotation out of tech into value investing. That seems to be happening right now. I've heard that the average value investor, their portfolio, 11 to 12% energy. So it matters to the secular rotation that's happening here out of technology. And now I realize that I, in a very articulate way, just said, if technology starts sucking, we may get some money. But I think that's a possibility.
That's been the headlines for the last 2 days. If just again, listening to those news shows, that's effectively been the rotation, right? Tech's been underperforming. People been moving into value. You drive into the office in the morning if you're actually driving into the office, and Bloomberg's got whatever analyst kind of talking about that's the trade of the day. I didn't actually know your stat about where value is invested, but if that's the case, then that makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, I mean, I know I'm talking my own book, but I'm very much a believer in terms of the E&Ps have it figured out right now. And so capital coming in from a valuation perspective is good. Said differently, capital coming in on a secondary basis, I don't want to see a ton of capital coming in on a primary basis and just kind of adding to capacity. I think we're not there yet to kind of know that how much incremental capacity we're going to need out of the US. I do think we've probably taken, as a globe, we've probably shortchanged ourselves a little bit over the last few years, and there could be, and hence, Goldman and B of A and others who've kind of talked about, some pretty high oil prices that could hit us on, some sort of a term basis. But, for you and me, we don't really like to model out. You might fantasize about what those super high prices look like, but, you're building out these models that are looking kind of 5 and 10 and years out. And, so what's an average commodity price to look like? And I think there's a healthy discipline now that if that capital rotation's happening, that's a secondary base that's not yet giving it's not resulting in the IPOs and all of the fresh capital that could really mess things up.
And I think that's right. And I actually think it holds.
I do too.
Which that shocks me. Having been in this my whole career, I think that that actually holds. I think another thing though that we have to do that's part and parcel of this, and it leads me into the next thing I want to talk to you about, is I think the financial discipline, I think providing the returns are important. I think something else that's really important is we somehow have to get the narrative back. I've said this a million times on the podcast. I get mocked for it, so I'll just say it again. I'll look right in the camera and just own it. But, my 3 children have lived the greatest life. I would love to come back as one of my children. And
I have heard you say this.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's all because of oil and gas. And if you ask them tomorrow, hey, do you want to get rid of oil and gas? They'd say yes in a heartbeat. We just lost the narrative. And the interesting thing about losing that narrative, and we can analyze it all we want. We're an industry run by a bunch of engineers that can't tell stories. We didn't tell anybody what was in frac fluid. I think that was kind of one of the big first things the environmentalists got. We can talk all about how the other side just doesn't trust us and the like. But I think that's really important, and it's something we need to take very seriously. We need to figure out a way to go through all the wonderful things we do and at least have a balanced discussion on this transition as opposed to us just getting regulated out of business. Because I'll tell you, I am a big believer in the bull run coming on commodity prices. And if we have $150 oil and everybody makes a lot of money and we act like, jerks that we have historically, it's not going to end well for us. It's going to end in windfall profits, taxes, more regulation, et cetera. So
I share those concerns. I have no followers on Twitter, but I'm going to mention my Twitter just because I have a feeling you have a few. So maybe, but I'm at Will Franklin and I got no followers. But when we were watching the championship game and the Energy Transfer commercial, do you remember the?
Yeah.
Did you? Yeah. And where everything starts disappearing, and it's like. I'm a huge Alex Epstein fan, and the moral case for fossil fuels and Schellenberger and Apocalypse Never. We create tremendous good for society, but we have totally lost the narrative. And, when things haven't gone perfectly, we probably haven't owned them soon enough. Maybe that's your point on like frac fluids. Like, there wasn't really anything in there. What were people so worried about, right? And it's like it was recipes that people were really worried
water
about.
And sand.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, so, but they all thought they had this proprietary, name your service company that like had their recipe that they wanted to protect. But
I think the challenge for us, because I like Alex Epstein a lot, I'm not sure, and I don't mean this derogatory about Alex, but I'm not sure how many people he convinces. I have this feeling that whenever we discuss energy advocacy, we're in an echo chamber.
Yeah.
And we're all sitting there, going, God, that's great. That's great. And I think, was it Dan Pickering who tweeted out, or no, it was Paul Sankey tweeted out the Energy Transfer commercial and said, hey, do you think that worked?
I think it was Pickering who said
Was it Pickering?
Yeah.
Okay. It was one of the two smarter people.
Because I replied, yeah, I think it's a start. And most people are like, no, we're talking to ourselves. I mean,
because that's really interesting. Because I think that's the challenge is how do we take, call it 15-year-old to 30-year-olds that have no idea what goes on to get their iPhones to come on or so they can get online and play Roblox or whatever.
Right.
The complexity and the necessity to do that, or all the intricacies that go into doing that. And that's a hard thing that I don't have an answer for.
No, I don't have any genius answers for it either, but it does start with somebody collecting the data and pulling together the information to share. And so if that's just being shared amongst the echo chamber, at least it's actually been pulled together because nobody else has been able to actually support what we all kind of knew intuitively. And, I think those people have done that. I think, the other side of the equation and part of why nobody cares is everybody is totally bought into, CO2 is going to kill us and it's mankind's number one challenge. And if you question that to any degree, then you are immediately labeled a climate denier. And, these, labels from either side are just not useful. And this, and this kind of brings me, this has gotten worse during COVID, right? Because we're all now in echo chambers online. That is a curated content based on algorithms that, that knows what you like and therefore serves you up more of it. And that kind of further isolates us. So we got to get people back actually together. And so this is just kind of fundamental human beings working together. How that's ultimately going to translate into hydrocarbons kind of defending themselves, I'm not wholly sure. But, that's also part of the reason that, I wanted to be here today is I do think that, I think it's important that people have spent their careers in the industry kind of stand up to talk about how important the industry is and are doing that from with regulatory influence, not to defend the industry and make sure that it gets a crony special treatment, but to ensure that people understand when they're making, calls for legislation, what are the long-term impacts? And we all get caught up in the movement of the day and what we need right now. And we kind of forget about the cascading follow-on effects. But as investors, like that's one thing we're taught to always think about, right? It's like whatever we do today, we need to be thinking about, particularly as private equity, where you're not recycling that money. It's like, what is this going to mean at my 5-year, my 7-year, my 10-year exit point, wherever that exit point comes? And let's make sure that we don't do something that gives us a decision tree that looks really bad, when we get 3 years out. And my fear is that because hydrocarbons have effectively become so shamed that we take short-term decisions. And I think a perfect example, and I just read this the other day. And so one, either I should have known it, or two, it's not true. So everybody should go and check and make sure. But we know that Europe right now is facing an energy crisis, and that is brought on by the fact that the wind hasn't been blowing, that they've been moving toward renewables, and it's also been brought on by the fact that there's been an underinvestment in hydrocarbons. And let's take Germany in particular. Germany's been taking their nuclear plants offline and retiring them early, with I think maybe over a decade left in their expected life. And what I heard about that recently, which is the part that needs to be kind of figured out, but that Angela Merkel had a close election and was being challenged by Greens. And one way that she wanted to overcome that was by saying, well, I'm green too. And so she agreed, I don't know how long ago this was, that she basically made this policy move to let's get rid of our nuclear. Well, that's a policy decision made years ago that's now unfolding today. The technology's not there from a battery perspective. The pipeline's not there and is under dispute with respect to Russia. And, does Europe want to be dependent upon Russian gas or not? That's a big question, which I can understand why people would be asking that. But they're asking it too late because they took their base load off the grid. And that's a problem when the wind isn't blowing.
And see, I think how that all comes about is we've lost the narrative. We've been excluded from the discussion. So, because I talked about this with the Texas ERCOT situation on my year-end summary, is I think the big miss that Texas did that Europe's doing now is no one was there to say, hey, guys, reliability matters. There are days when the wind doesn't blow. What are we going to do on that day? And, I think the uneducated energy person was, there's no difference between solar and wind and hydrocarbons. And so this whole notion of base load versus peaking or interruptible, whatever you wanted to call it, I think happened. And so the thing I wanted to ask you about, and I always love visiting with you, but I wanted you to come in on, you're actually doing something about it, which I think you're certifiably crazy to do, but let's talk about this. You're running for the state house in Texas.
I am. Yeah. And, that's what most of my friends say. You're crazy. And why would you do that? And, I've been in energy for almost 3 decades. Last decade's been really tough. And, so my standard answer to oil and gas people is, I've withstood oil and gas for the last 10 years. How much worse can it be? And I don't really know yet because I got to get through an election to see, but it's been a new world, but it's this energy stuff that really drove me to this position. And, with my kids, I've sat around the table for 20 years. My eldest is 20, talking about things that are important to me. And one of these things is energy and energy policy. And I feel like the nation is taking the wrong turn. And I'm fearful that the state may take the wrong turn, particularly as our electorate, changes. And part of it's changing for a really good reason. We still do have largely a capitalist system, a low regulatory system. And, that promotes entrepreneurship and attracts people. And so, we're seeing companies move here. That's bringing jobs, that brings opportunities. All of that's good. The unfortunate thing is those people, everybody worries. So I'm running as a Republican just to make it clear where I am. And, Republican concerns are, is Texas turning blue? And, when I think particular about energy policy, I'm really concerned that, these people are coming without an understanding of how important hydrocarbons are to Texas's economy. And so, and what do I mean by that? So direct and indirect employment. This is from a study from PwC, I think, and this is a pre-COVID, so 19, but 22% of Texans were directly and indirectly employed in the hydrocarbon business. So super important to our employment base. We're not fully diversified away from it. With respect to county taxes and mineral royalties, oil and gas provides, and this is a Texoga number, but $14 billion to the state last year. So, that's a meaningful
schools, roads.
That's where I was going. That finances our schools. Everybody wants their kids to get a good education. That is one. Now, we may disagree in terms of how we get there, but one area of agreement, because it's good to talk about where we agree. Conservatives and liberals both want to ensure that our kids get educated. And so how does that happen? Well, hydrocarbons are important there. Our infrastructure, if we want companies to come here, we got to have roads that work. And infrastructure is funded through hydrocarbon taxes. So, yeah, this stuff is very important to us. And, so like what I like to say, and maybe I've already said it on this hydrocarbon. The other thing is a politician, you say the same thing like 20 times a day. It's like fundraising for a fund. And you can't remember, like, did I say this in the conversation or not? But,
by the way, fundraising, I always had to have a script. So whatever page I was on in the pitch book, I knew what I was going to say. And if any of the marketing people interrupted, took me in another direction, after the meeting, I'd say, hey, that's great. If you don't like the script, I have no pride of authorship there, but let's not change the script in the middle of a meeting. Because if you get me off track, I'll tell the same story 2 and 3 times. And I love Mike Hines. I mean, he's still like my brother today. Mike got in there and just started talking. I mean, during fundraising, I'm like, no, script on page 3, we do this. So you'll learn that. The other good thing you'll learn about being a politician is you get asked a question,
right?
You repeat the question,
and then
you have a bridge. You have a bridge statement, and then you say whatever you want to say.
Yeah,
so
I've kind of found that I'm working my way into that, and I've never been the great fundraiser for Limerock. I'm not the good storyteller and the like, and I that's one of the things that I told the team is like, when I embark on this, I absolutely hope to win, and I'm not doing it for a vanity project. I've never been the popular guy in the room. That's just hasn't been, I'm naturally an introvert, happy to go talk to people. But I told him, I was like, look, one thing I will be much better at is sitting in front of people and asking them for money, because you know what I do every day, all day? I call people and ask them for money. I mean, you just can't have enough money to run a campaign. And then I, my evenings are events or whatever. And then my weekends are out in the community, knocking on doors, saying hello to strangers and finding out, what's important to them. And that's like one of the really interesting parts of running for office is a lot of people don't want to talk to you. A lot of people aren't home. But people do open their doors and people open up their hearts. I mean, people are worried about things and they meet somebody who I do care. So when I say pretends to care, I don't mean to say that I don't care. But when somebody's at the door, when somebody's at your door, you don't ever really know how genuine they are or not. But people are worried and they're ready to kind of talk about their things. And you just get this feeling. But one thing that I would say about it, which goes back to our conversation about energy as well, is, there's angst and concern and nobody's really talking about hope and opportunity. And so if you want to talk about one thing that the other side does better, and by the other side, I mean the Greens. And I also, from my perspective, I'm talking about liberals, but they're better at talking about caring for people and like this sense of empathy and the like. And what I think it's great to be a conservative in Texas because we do have a hopeful message to offer up. And this is what I think we have to seize on if we can get beyond the echo chamber that you referred to for energy. We have a very positive message for society to deliver if we can figure out how to deliver it. But I also feel that as a conservative here, we have this entrepreneurial system, this capitalist system that's working. If you watch Fox News, all you're going to hear about is, the evils of socialism and the like. And, that's an area where a lot of conservatives get their news. And I share a lot of those concerns. But if that's how we're going to attract the next generation of voters as conservatives, we have a challenge. And so
let me cut you off real quick. Give me the stats of what you're running for. What house seat is this?
Sure.
Geography, et cetera.
Yeah. So it's state of Texas, District 133. It's effectively the Memorial Villages memorial out through the energy corridor. So I-10 is the northern border, Westheimer is the southern border, goes out to George Bush Park or Highway 6 out west. And then the eastern side, it's kind of Chimney Rock, kind of north of San Felipe, and then it almost goes to the Galleria south of there. So that's the general area
and
where I'm running.
Who's the existing?
So Jim
rep?
Murphy is the incumbent, and he announced his retirement back in September. And with a retiring incumbent, there's pent up demand, I guess I would say, amongst people who want to run. So I was the last person to enter. So there are 4 competitors plus myself. So I'm a free markets person, and the voters are going to have a free markets choice. There are 5 of us to choose from, which, I think it's good. And look, I obviously think I'm the better one, or I wouldn't have gotten into the race. But it's not one of those races where I think voters are going to have to hold their noses. I think there's some good opportunities, and I think the district will be well represented.
And the Republican primary is in effect the election, right? If I'm guessing, this is a 60% Republican seat.
It's 65. It's 65. It's an R+15 sort of district.
Okay,
yeah.
I got you. So back 30 years ago when I was at Rice, I managed 5 campaigns for state representative. And what the name of the game back then was you got your voter roll, and so you knew whose house you were going to knock on. But it was literally door-to-door retail politics. I mean, you were sending them a letter saying, hey, I'm going to be in your neighborhood over the next couple of days. You'd knock on doors. You'd chat with them. You'd send them a letter afterwards saying, it was great meeting you, or sorry I missed you. And that was literally how you did it. Because you had back then, call it, I think 125,000 people in a rep district. Only half of them were registered to vote. Take it beyond that, only half of them even showed up to vote. So that's 30,000. And then when you looked at, kind of the Democratic primary voters, you wouldn't go talk to them anyway. And in a general election, the Republican primary voters were going to vote for you anyway. It was actually a pretty small swath. So you literally could go knock on every door. How is that changing with technology? And are there elements of that still around?
That is still, of all the advice that I've gotten, including from the incumbent, it was very nice to spend some time with me. He's like, nothing replaces knocking on a door. And when I knock on doors and talk to voters, the consistent message is there's only one other politician who's ever knocked on my door, and it's Jim Murphy. So I take that as a good sign.
It's interesting you say that, because I've got 2 block walking stories from back in the day. So
I'm going to recruit you if you can clean up.
I actually might be able to help you with some mechanics on walking, because what you want is somebody walking with you that's got the clipboard, can keep the notes, and they actually ring the doorbell when you're walking up. So there's literally a system to this that I was pretty good at back in the day. So I'm happy to come walk with you. It's interesting you say
Chuck's going to be taking my notes.
There we go. It'll still be a volunteer job like this one. So that'll be perfect. No, but it's interesting. So 2 or 3 of the campaigns I ran were in effect West U Bel Air state rep races. And when I would go out with, I had a couple of candidates in there. When I went out with them, they would say the same thing. They would say, no politician has come and knocked on my door since Tom DeLay. Tom DeLay was the greatest block walker. He had a pest control business that filed for bankruptcy in the middle of his first state rep race, yet he knocked on every Republican primary voter's door twice. The guy was a machine.
He got them twice himself?
Yes, he was a machine. That. The other great story, because around that time when DeLay first got elected to Congress, another young candidate running was an economics professor from North Texas State named Dick Army, who was running up in Dallas. And a buddy of mine was his consultant. And so Tom DeLay would hit, in a 3-hour period at night, 175 doors. I mean, he was just a machine. He had a great spiel, all this. Dick Armey was hitting like 2 or 3. And so the consultant flies in to say, what's going on? Turns out Dick Armey was going in, having pie with the people, because they'd say, you want to come in and have some pie? And Dick Armey would say, sure. And he'd talk for, 2 hours to one voter. But it is retail.
I haven't fully worked out that art. I can't imagine getting 175 doors in 3 hours. I think, we target significantly fewer than that. Yeah. So that's tough, but it's still the same thing. The math, a house district now is roughly 200,000 people. And then you've got the kids. So, you kind of reduce it down to the voting population. And then you got to depend on, okay, is it a primary or a general? And what's going on. So in a year where there's not really a big race on the ballot, then you might get a primary turnout in our district of maybe 15,000 people. But in a year where there's a presidential race, you're going to get probably 30,000 people who kind of show up. So we do modeling, and now, and the data analytics is a big part of this as well. So I've got consultants.
I was computer printouts, like literally the green and white paper with the holes in the side.
Right. So my consultants, we have voter turnout models where we're kind of modeling who all's on the ballot. And, this year we've got a competitive at the primary. There's a competitive gubernatorial race, attorney general land office. So those are big Texas jobs, right? And you've got, for Republicans, going back to Glenn Youngkin, who we mentioned earlier, I think Republicans kind of feel like there is going to be some swing their way coming, which generally happens in a midterm election, that, the party who owns the White House doesn't perform as well. And so there's an energize in the Republican base that will probably bring a higher number of voters than would normally be in just a gubernatorial year. So we have our models. I won't give you the exact number, but that kind of ranges where it is. And then you're kind of looking at that. How does that break down across households? And then how do I touch those households? Obviously I can't get to, let's say we think there'll be like 24,000 people show up just to take a number, and that's 24,000 voters, and people are married, and then some have voting age kids who are in there. So maybe you're looking at 17,000, 18,000 houses out of that. Like, that's impossible for me to hit 18,000 houses starting in November, or pretty much next to impossible. But I am out there as much as I can. And then we're doing a lot of analytics on, okay, of the people who turns out the most frequently. And then we're doing polling of issues as opposed to things that I'm talking about to try to identify, because a big chunk of it is just getting your turnout. So finding those people who share your position of issues and then getting them there. And then the other thing that we get to use today is targeted digital. So, you're not seeing any of my ads, but if you were a Republican primary voter living in my district, then, they effectively know devices at least to an IP address, which is a household. And so we know if we've got Republican primary voters at this address, then anything that uses that IP address is likely a Republican primary voter. So we're targeting digital ads to those people this is very important to me because I'm the least politically known of amongst my 4 opponents. And so it's really important that I quickly build name ID. And it's like everything in life, it's all come down to data analytics and how you find the right people and deliver your message to them.
Quite frankly, too, I think it's important from an educational point of view that folks ought to know who you are. When they walk in, know what you stand about, et cetera. I always, when I would talk with candidates about it, the selfish side is I want to convince somebody to vote for me and then turn them out. But I think the democracy side of it's really important. You need to go tell those people what you care about so that when you get elected and you don't do it, they can call you on
That's
it,
right.
you know?
That's right.
And I think so I think that's the other side of it that's really important.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I'll knock on doors and a lot of times I'll get, oh yeah, we're Republicans. And I'm like, well, hang on. It's a Republican primary. You're going to have 5 of us to choose from. So just being a Republican isn't enough. You got to figure out whom it is that you want to support amongst the 5 of us. And this is like another lesson learned. I mean, you know, civics is so important. And, you know, we do not plug in enough at the primary level. And we all, not all, but there have been numerous elections where people have been frustrated that they show up in November and they don't like their choices. And the question is, how are these our choices? And the answer is, you got to get involved at the primary level in order for you to get choices that you like when you wind up there in November. And unfortunately, that requires work because the ballots are lengthy and, you know, you don't have 2 people. You've got 5 people in my case that you've got to research and kind of figure out. And that takes time. And obviously, you're not going to do that on every single race, but you better find the ones that are important to you and go and figure it out. And that way you'll be much happier when you show up in November to kind of say, okay, you know, I feel like my choices are representative of what I would have expected, as opposed to I didn't get involved and I left it to other people and I'm not happy with whom I have to choose from.
I think that's a fair ask.
Yeah.
I really do. That is a fair ask because, you know, to some degree, when we sit around and say we hate our politicians, it's like, well, we voted for them. I mean, you know, it's
well, a lot of people want to say our system's broken and the 2-party system is broken, and it definitely has issues. But one way we can take responsibility to make it better is just educating ourselves at the primary level.
Yeah. And it's interesting at the retail level, because one of the things I think that is way underappreciated is we sit there and we watch Fox News, CNN, whatever, and we see these politicians, Nancy Pelosi, McConnell, whoever, and we go, "Oh my gosh, they're idiots! Look at that! They misspoke." I've actually ridden a elevator with Nancy Pelosi. I got to chat with Jesse Jackson, and I'm trying to think of people that are politically different than me that I've got. I rode an elevator with Donna Brazil one time, and the thing that's amazing about them, they're incredibly charming. I mean, Nancy Pelosi and I laughed the whole time, and if it wouldn't have been inappropriate, I would have said, "Let's go grab a drink," you know. And you forget just how incredibly charming these people are at an individual level. You are not the Speaker of the House of the Congress,
right,
and not able to charm someone
right.
on a one-on-one basis.
Right.
And so, yeah. I think that
I thought you were making a declaratory statement that I am not the Speaker of the House. And I'm like, yes, you're right. And I probably don't have that charisma.
Not yet. No, but I mean, it's just, and where I was going with that is just, you know, being at the retail level, all politics are retail, and it's very true.
Yeah, it is. And, you know, those statements I think are true. I think you can look at politicians on both sides, and charisma does go a long way. I think, you know, I think character should trump charisma. I think that's something that we have to remind ourselves. And you want a mix of all of that with some wisdom and experience. And, you know, to me, if you're kind of describing your ideal, you know, these people are leaders, right? So your ideal leader, you want a mix of all of that, but charisma goes a long way. And these are short periods in which you got to make a decision, right? I mean,
yeah.
You didn't explore the race. The person showed up at your door. They talked to you for a few minutes and you're like, I like that person, or no, I don't. And so I'm choosing a different name. And, you know, a lot of times that's how votes are made. Particularly, you know, the country is still largely independent. And so, you know, those of us who tend to vote, you know, more partisan, by the time you get to November, you pretty much know whom you're voting for. But if you're an independent and, you know, you are trying to figure out like that can really differentiate your ability to kind of drive the vote and, you know, from a partisan perspective, that takes place at the primary.
It does. So I'm going to leave issues to the general type politics for another forum for you. You can go talk about those things, because I think most of my audience are energy-based folks. Let's spend just a bit of time on energy policy, when you show up in Austin, and we can go back and forth. I think number one, we have a real problem with stranded wells, abandoned wells out there in terms of, I mean, we've been drilling wells in Texas since the 1920s. We plugged and abandoned a well in the 50s. There's not an engineer out there that'll say cement lasts for an entire lifetime. We've got temporarily abandoned wells that have been temporarily abandoned for 12 years and the like. Yeah, you get to see all this. I think it's a real issue. I think it's something we're going to have to address. Any thoughts on maybe what a regulatory framework would look at? And I come at it from the view of, we in the industry really need to figure that out, and we need to self-police and or do it at the state level, or else the EPA is going to come in, and that's not going to end well for us.
Yeah. Your last point is probably one of the driving motivators for myself in terms of, I want to keep the federal government out of what I, as I said before, view as Texas's economic engine. And so I don't want them to use backdoor federal policies in order to get into our business. That has effectively been handed over to the Railroad Commission with respect to, who has administrative authority over it. But I can't disagree that we have, well, let's forget all of the wells that have already been abandoned, but we have a bunch of wells that ultimately are going to need to be abandoned relatively soon, maybe absent the recent uptick in prices. But
Right.
Stripper wells suddenly seem a lot more interesting than they probably did. But I remain. Look, I remain much a believer in free markets. And, this, I think, is one of these clear messages that's coming from investors. If you want to talk about some of the stuff of E that really does make sense, that isn't just like greenwashing, it's like, you got to be a responsible operator from, the moment that you lease land and permit that well till the moment that you fully abandon that well. And, because you've been through it out from a diligence perspective. When you're buying things, we're always worried about kind of chain of title, and is something going to come back to me, and ensuring that, that things are sold on and moved to responsible operators so that we don't wind up wearing something in the future. And that's particularly a problem for perpetual entities, public companies and private companies that are family owned that aren't going anywhere. They want to be. So there are some natural reasons why the industry should care about it. It's not as though, those of us in the industry know, it's not as though we all just kind of go about our job saying this doesn't matter and I ought to ignore it.
Well, and I want to give us props because we take enough grief in private equity. I actually think private equity was really good on that front, because we would go into a new area. There's a Wolf Camp bench that we're going to drill brand new horizontals on. First thing we did was clean up all the old infrastructure because it wasn't going to help us. And we knew if we were going to turn around and sell that asset, we were in effect going to have a total examination by the buyer.
Right.
And so we did a lot of good work on that. I actually think where horizontal drilling and modern fracking wasn't done is more the problem, as opposed to where it was done. Because we seem to, we always knew we were going to sell that to somebody else. Yeah, we should get credit for that.
Agreed. I'll take the credit.
There we go. Perfect.
I'll take a positive.
Perfect.
Yeah. I would say one thing that really drove me into, wanting to get into this is really that intersection of federal policy. And it's why I don't disagree with you that we need to take care of this stuff internally before the feds get here. But one of the things that the feds are doing to Texas's hydrocarbon business is, some kind of indirect things. Obviously, we don't have federal lands. We don't have those issues that New Mexico and Colorado have, where drilling moratoriums really affect our business. But, and this is clearly where one of my own biases will come through, but I do think it's important. But what we are seeing is we're seeing federal energy policy that is very geared toward renewables. And I think that while there's a lot of causes, we'll probably never know all of them, but there's a lot of issues as to why we had our debacle in last February with respect to Winter Storm Uri or however you say it. One of, I think, the challenges is we've had these federal production tax credits for wind that have effectively incentivized a lot of wind to come onto the grid, and they've taken away the profit opportunity for thermal generation. And as a result, when profit opportunity goes away, reinvestment goes away. And, we talked about earlier the importance of reliability. And so as you have more renewables coming on, we're losing the reliability. And that reliability, I think, comes from the hydrocarbons. And, particularly, coal, moving from coal to gas. And just a side note, Toby Rice wrote a phenomenal letter to Senator Warren. If you didn't see it, right?
I did.
Okay. Yeah, really good. And talk about really making change that's why I wonder what the real end game of climate change awareness is. If they really want to improve the planet, just moving everybody to.
I've said it multiple times on the podcast that if we truly wanted to do something, the United States, with our little brother Europe, needs to sit down with China and India and say, no more coal, but we get the fact that we got here sooner. We'll finance natural gas infrastructure for you. And we're going to have to take somewhat on the, I don't think it's an unfair ask for China and India to say, hey, you got to cut us in on that because you guys got to benefit from your long run of cheap coal. We should get to do the same. I could actually live with some sort of subsidy there. Now, devil's in the details on all that. And I get that China's our enemy. But at right. The end of the day, if we truly wanted to do something about CO2 emissions, that's it. That's the big game changer.
Those are the big game changers. Moving them from coal to gas is the massive game changer if CO2 is like the chief concern. And so I question what are people's chief concern. But anyway, that's the big move, which brings me back to, Texas and, between 21 and 24 for projects that, have been proposed, it's 38 gigawatts of renewable energy to be added to Texas's grid. It's 1 gigawatt of thermal generation with a base load based on population estimate of 6 gigawatts. So we are continuing to add renewables, I think largely driven by, subsidies create incentives. Right. And I think you can't discount that. And with those subsidies, though, we are adding destabilization to our grid. And I think that's an unfortunate result of federal policy, but we are going to pay the price of it. And I think, that's important because none of us want to go through another February. And let's be really frank. I mean, that is another form of a regressive tax because I don't know if you have one or not, but even though you're not collecting a paycheck, you probably could have a generator if you wanted to have a generator. That's not a choice for most people to right. have a way to get through a period like this. And yet, we've got policies that are driving these changes before the technology is ready for it. And so that's an indirect way where federal policy is impacting something that is very state specific. And I think that's really bad because I think economy ultimately trumps all. And that doesn't mean there aren't a whole lot of other issues, which I'll talk about on another forum. But over the medium term and long term, the way that we see eye to eye with the other side, no matter how you define the other side, is by having opportunity. And opportunity, I think, is defined as economy. And Texas is winning right now, but if we have an unstable grid in the future, these businesses that are coming here are going to quit coming here. And so we need to be cognizant of the incentives that are in place. And if it's not a Texas incentive, but it's a federal incentive, then we need to figure out in the State House how we can fix that. And I think there's I don't have the master plan, but I do think there's an element of ensuring that the cost of reliability is burdened by each form of power. And right now, renewables are not burdened with a reliability charge, which is therefore causing too much of that coming on. And I think, so that's an incentive that way, the wrong way, and it's a disincentive for more investment in thermal generation, all of which, is ultimately, I think, going to be harmful for our hydrocarbon business. And again, I don't want to go be a crony for hydrocarbons. I just want a free market energy transition, and we're not experiencing a free market energy transition. And that results in issues like we had last February.
Yeah. In my year-end summary of the energy business podcast I did, I said really what the whole mess was in February with ERCOT is we were just trying to be good neighbors to the relocated Californians, make them feel at home. We can mess up energy too, guys. Don't worry about it. It's not just you guys, but so one other energy policy thing I want to touch on, because you hit the things I wanted to talk about. When you get elected, I'm actually going to come to Austin. We'll go eat at Franklin Barbecue. I'm going to push you for a
relation, by the way.
That's true. Aaron Franklin's actually a really nice guy. I don't know if you've gotten to meet him. I've gotten to meet him a couple of times. Just the nicest guy and really a barbecue geek. I mean, truly just loves it. I believe.
I can make a pretty mean brisket though if you check out my Instagram feed. But
nice.
But I'm not an Aaron Franklin.
Nice. But I think the push on cleaning up the abandoned wells, as much as I hate, I've only voted for a libertarian for president in my life. I've never voted for a Republican or a Democrat. I always vote for the libertarian. So I'm a big free market guy. I do think there needs to be an element of kind of just more enforcement by the Railroad Commission to the rules that are already on the books. And I think if we get in a situation, I think our budget right now is about $30 million a year that the state pays, because, you sell something to somebody else, they go out of business. There are stranded pockets where there are issues. So there may need to be more money from it. I do think, to your point earlier, though, is the industry shouldn't be the one to just pay this, because let's face it, Amazon benefited from the fact that we had cheap oil prices. And so there needs to be some sort of sharing of the burden of that, because it wasn't just oil company profits that need to be burdened.
But you come to Austin and let's have a sit down and we'll problem solve it.
We'll talk that. And then the last thing, energy relay. And so we talked about ERCOT, which I agreed. The thing I also did on the end of the year summary is, and I did it in real time when the ERCOT mess was going on, I went to the websites and got the actual wind speeds going on at various spots. So like the Amarillo Airport, down in South Texas, where Los Vientos, the largest wind power. And I was pulling all that. You need 10 miles per hour to generate any electricity. And really the nameplate's about 25 miles per hour that you need. I mean, around Amarillo, there was 1 6-hour period that averaged more than 20 miles per hour wind during that kind of week and a half, 2 weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, the wind just didn't blow.
And that's what's happening in Europe right now.
Yeah, that's exactly what's happening in Europe. And I'm actually pro wind. I think we should have, I think we need more of everything. It's just, we've got to focus on the reliability aspect, because to your point, I mean, people die.
Well,
if we don't have enough power.
I will rephrase your pro wind to simply say I'm pro free markets and I'm pro private property rights, and private property rights go down and they go up as well. And so if that's what people want to do with their money, I think I'm all for that.
Right.
And that's why I call it a free market energy transition.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. The one other issue that you'll have to deal with in the state house that right now I think we're a leader on, and I think it's very important we stay that way, is just Bitcoin mining. Because if you look at the 35 gigawatts of renewables that are going to be built, a lot of the justification to that, to your point, is the tax policy from the feds, but it's also serving Bitcoin mining. And I just think that can be a huge industry, growth industry for us. It allows those renewables to be built and actually have opportunity there. Because, I think we've only got 12 gigawatts of transmission from the Permian Basin to where the people are. So that's going to have to be built out as well. And so I think having an energy person at the table when we're having those discussions is going to be really important.
I agree. And federally for my district, so I'm currently in what's called District 7, which was at the federal level, George H.W. Bush's seat. It's going to be redistricted into District 38 because they took Westview and Bel Air, which are now the more liberal part of the district. Those have been carved out and been left with District 7, and we have this new District 38. But my whole point in saying all that was it was pretty shocking to me when I went and looked and saw that from a federal perspective, there's nobody in DC from either side of the aisle who comes from the energy business. And when you think about federal policy is so focused on energy policy right now, and there's nobody from Texas with an energy background, sitting up there, that was a pretty surprising revelation to me. And, so as I was looking at this state house and looking at, my competition and didn't see that experience and knowing how important energy is to Houston and to our district, I thought we need to have somebody who's at those tables kind of talking about it with some informed perspective. And even if none of us can know everything, but there's also a benefit when you spend your entire career in an industry, there's a benefit of relationships that come, right? Where you at least know the right experts to tap and begin to, you can come and sit down and you and I can talk about, and you can share your ideas, and you can probably bring, 3 or 4 CEOs that you've backed to kind of talk about what we ought to be doing on well abandonment. And, and we can get there on Bitcoin as well. But the point is, you need somebody who's informed, who has a decision-making framework that they use. And you and I know we're very good at using help when we need help because we don't know everything. And that's part of what private equity is kind of acknowledging what you don't know, identifying the risks, finding people who do so that you can assess that risk and determine that you're going to get paid to take that risk. And we need some of that in Austin.
Because I still think the most effective thing the other side did is they convinced the world that the only reason wind and solar don't power everything is because the big bad oil companies won't let it happen. Instead of there are truly differences, qualitative differences to the power generation from both sources. And so you're right. I mean, not having anyone at the table to just say, time out.
Right.
The sun doesn't shine certain days. The wind doesn't blow on certain days, which is fine, but we got to solve for that, and batteries aren't there yet.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So give me the details in terms of where can people go to find you on social media, the web, when's the primary date, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, I'll keep it really simple. You can go to willfranklin.com. All my social media is linked at the very top. So that'll get you to everything. But Twitter is at Will Franklin. And the others are versions of Will Franklin for Texas, but getting into the spelling, just find it on the website. The election is March 1st. Early voting starts Valentine's Day, February 14th, and it goes through the 25th. If you're not yet registered to vote in Texas, you have to be registered 30 days before Election Day. So I would just say get registered now. You've got 2 weeks left. So get yourself registered so that you have a voice. Even if you're voting in the other party, like get registered, be an active participant, and then complain all you want when you're unhappy. But if you don't participate, I mean, talk about going into an echo chamber. It's like, what are you doing if you're not participating and then complaining about how bad everything is? So I would encourage you to do so. And of course, I would love the support on March 1st. And so I want you to register and come out and vote for me. And if you want to give to the campaign, do that as well.
So appreciate you coming on. I've known you a long time. You're way too fine a person to take this advice. So I'll more tell it as a story.
Okay.
When I was running a campaign for state rep, when I was a senior at Rice, it was the Republican primary for the Westview Bel Air district for State House. three great candidates. Tim Turner, who's a landman in the oil and gas business. You may have met Kyle Janik, who's a doctor, sharp guy, good guy, and Mike Shelby, who unfortunately has passed away, but he was an amazing human. He was an assistant district attorney with Johnny Holmes. Then he was a U.S. prosecutor, and he was the guy that they sent in to do the heavy-duty drug cases. I mean, so anyway, three amazing candidates. I was working for Mike Shelby, and this is the thing I pulled. So I was out one night and with one of Mike Shelby's friends, and we were putting up yard signs because, you go block walk all day, and the people that would say they'd take a yard sign, 9 o'clock when you shut down walking, go back, get the yard signs, drive back out, put them out. Right. So we're doing that.
Yes,
I'm doing
still
it.
Do that.
Yeah. I'm doing that with one of Mike's friends, and Mike's friend sees, Tim Turner signs and goes, man, I can't stand that Turner guy. And he starts knocking them all down. And he's like picking them up, throwing them in the back of the truck. And, I'm a senior in college, and this is a 50-year-old man who may or may not have been in law enforcement. So definitely a man's man. So he getting rid of all the Tim Turner signs. So anyway, we put up the Shelby signs and we drive back. I drop him off. And I was worried about that night. And I didn't know, do I go tell Mike about it? What do I do? So I actually went and got some Kyle Janik signs and put them where the Tim Turner signs used to be. And Tim and Kyle went to war. Their two camps spent the whole time tearing down each other's signs. And they kept calling Mike, can you believe that, Tim's doing that? Can you believe Kyle's doing that? And anyway, at the end of the day, I finally fessed up to Mike after the election. Kyle wound up winning, and Kyle wound up being state rep and then a state senator and all. And I was like, yeah, I kind of did that.
Well, I'll say, time has moved on. So,
you're too fine a person to.
Character matters, but two, like everybody has a Ring doorbell. So you will be on camera. And that's one thing, when you're knocking on a door, you're on camera immediately. So you have to remember that. But two, it does still happen. Sign went up for me in one of my supporters' yards, and they left their house at 11 and they came home at 3 and it was gone. And it was like, really? And yeah, I mean, that's campaigns.
That is.
They go away, unfortunately, but I don't do that.
I told that story last because I don't think we actually keep that in. But anyway, I knew it was
yeah,
fun.
after you said
I knew it was funny, but it was as I told it, I go, that's not something that's going to get cut in.